On a foggy and cold night, I was awakened from my sleep by the flashing lights of police cars and crackling sounds of their radios outside our door. Several vehicles and people had filled the street. Looking out the window, I saw a gathering of people in our neighbor's yard. It was the home of Mr. and Mrs. Vales, our elderly neighbors. What had happened, I wondered. I threw on some clothes and went outside. My family was already out there talking to the police. When I approached, an officer asked if I had seen anything. I was asleep, I said. My family was clueless, and the police weren't disclosing any information. The crowded group of police officers took photos and gathered evidence. Later, they lifted a body bag onto a stretcher. As the stretcher was being moved towards a vehicle, a shiver ran down my spine. I could swear it moved. Once the commotion settled, only a few police officers talking to the neighbors in their cars remained. The chaos had dispersed, but the mystery it left behind deepened. Returning home with my family, my father mentioned that the deceased was Mrs. Vales. I was shocked. "What about Mr. Vales?" I asked. He hadn't been found. There was no trace of him. Suspicions arose that he might have been kidnapped. According to the police's theory, the elderly couple was targeted for abduction, and a struggle ensued between Mrs. Vales and the culprits. During breakfast, as we discussed all of this, I could sense the fear and stress my family was under. It was understandable, given that all these events took place in the house right across from ours. At school that day, I felt like a ghost. The only thing on my mind was what I had seen and heard that night. They were such a sweet, elderly couple. Good people. I'm sure they never harmed anyone. They lived modestly and kindly. I couldn't wrap my head around what had happened to this humble and loving couple. In the following days, we anxiously waited for any news of the culprits being caught, but there was none. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, along with Mr. Vales. However, over the next few days, we started hearing noises inside the house. My father, thinking it might be a rat or something similar, filled the basement and secluded parts of the house with traps and poison. But I knew it wasn't a rat, or anything like it. I was afraid to talk to my family about the silhouette I'd seen 2 nights in a row, standing across the road in the very yard where Mrs. Vales was killed. First time I saw it, I thought it might have been a police officer. But no, it just stood there, seemingly staring into my eyes. I was frightened and couldn't bring myself to talk to my family. And even if I did, I doubted they would take it seriously and would dismiss it as stress related. I was afraid to move around the house thinking that silhouette, was wandering inside. I tried not to dwell on it, but at night, whenever I looked out the window, the silhouette was there, still observing me. 3 days in, there was still no progress on the case. As night fell, I was once again sitting in my room, filled with fear. Suddenly, a sound shook the entire house. I rushed out of my room, screaming. My parents were awake, rushing towards my room. My mother hugged me, and behind my father, we cautiously searched the whole house. The arrival of the police didn't take long. My mother, already on edge, had already contacted them. The officers checked the house. There was no one. Nothing was broken or misplaced. Everything was in its place. One area remained unchecked, our basement. When we went down to the basement, we were horrified. All the traps for rodents were smashed and scattered around. Food from the shelves we used as a pantry was spilling out. The boxes of food had been opened and toppled. The lock on the pantry's entrance was broken. As we tried to recover from the shock, the police finished their check, and my father changed the lock. We locked all the doors and secured the windows. Someone had gotten in, maybe a hungry homeless person. The police mentioned they had received reports of a few more houses being invaded. We were in a state of panic. In our supposedly safe neighborhood, even around our house, homeless people, criminals, and kidnappers were freely roaming. One even entered our house. After the murder in the house across from us, these events terrified us. It took my father several hours to convince us that the house was now safe. I still couldn't bring myself to mention the silhouette I'd seen. I didn't want to scare my mother further, and I still couldn't believe what I had seen. I was convinced I was losing my mind and was terrified. We headed to our rooms. I glanced out the window again. It was still there. I was frozen. This time, it wasn't just standing. It had raised its arm and was pointing at me. I felt like I was going to faint from fear. As I took a step back to move away from the window, I bumped into something. I began to tremble. Was it my mother? My father? My father? The homeless person that got into our pantry? No. Adrenaline hit me hard. It was Mr. Vales. With his contorted and emaciated body, he stood before me. He looked like a creature emerged from a swamp covered in filth and blood. My eyes widened. When I noticed the knife in his hand, I knew I had to run. But he was holding onto my arm so tight, I thought it might tear off. Suddenly, he took a deep breath and swung the knife towards me. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, I pushed Mr. Vales away. As he fell to the ground, his knife cut my arm. I screamed and ran out of my room towards my parents' room. They had heard the scream and were already coming towards me. Mr. Vales also ran out of the room after me, aiming to catch me. But my father was prepared. He fired his gun twice. I never saw that silhouette again. I believe it was Mrs. Vales and that she was trying to warn me. I was living alone in a small apartment in a big city. When I moved in, my next-door neighbor, a handsome man about my age, offered to show me how the laundry room worked. I didn't think the washer could possibly be that complicated, but I didn't mind spending a few minutes alone with this guy. That, it turned out, was a mistake. "I like your hair," he said, winking at me as we crammed into the small elevator. "Oh, thanks," I said, tugging at the tips of my long blonde hair. "Is it your natural hair color?" he asked. This is not how I expected the conversation to go. Yeah, I guess." "You have to guess," he said after a slightly too long pause. "No, I guess I don't." Sorry if that came across as weird, he continued after another slightly too long pause. "It's just Mother is a hairdresser, and she instilled me with a strong sense of aesthetics when it comes to women's hair." I was definitely regretting taking him up on his offer when the elevator came to a halt 2 floors below, and he pushed open the door to show a dark basement. I couldn't help but think that nobody would be able to hear me scream down there. I briefly considered slamming the elevator door closed and getting the hell out of there, but I couldn't bring myself to being that rude to my new neighbor. I was probably just being paranoid anyway. "Oh, cool," I responded, following him around the corner into the little room that contained the washer and dryer. "So, these are the buttons for the program," he said, his eyes not quite meeting mine. As he continued the explanation, he kept looking just over my shoulders and my head, but never actually making eye contact. I figured he was embarrassed at how forward he had been before, and calmed down a little as time passed and he still hadn't assaulted me. And that's it. I walked out of the little room, him following behind. I could hear him breathing and felt deeply uncomfortable as we crammed back into the tiny elevator. "Just let me know if you have any problems, okay?" As we exited the elevator, he still didn't meet my eyes. I turned away from him and it clicked. My hair. He had been staring at my hair the whole time. I repressed the shutter, hurried into my apartment, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Of course, I got a creepy neighbor, just my luck. As it turned out, I hardly ever saw him, so it wasn't really a problem for the most part. The laundry room, on the other hand, I got to see again many more times, way more than I wanted to. You see, the machine had this annoying habit of finishing a bit later than what it said it would on the display. At first, I just blamed myself. I had this bad habit of only setting a timer once I was back in my apartment, and so I just assumed I kept getting it wrong. Slowly, it started to dawn on me that it was, in fact, the washer that was late, not me that it was, in fact, the washer that was late, not me that was early. I tried the obvious solution, simply adding 5 minutes to my timer. But all that did was show me that the washer wasn't always late, and it wasn't always 5 minutes either. I'm not going to pretend like this was a mystery that I lost sleep over, but I did grumble about it weekly, as I hated spending time in the creepy basement. I didn't lose sleep over it, that is, until I found out why it happened. I had tossed my dirty underwear into the washer, turned it on, and taken the elevator back up like always. I groaned loudly as I realized my mistake. I had left my keys in the basement. Back down into the basement I went. As the elevator slid down into what I by now thought of as a dark abyss, I saw through the little window that the light was on out there. I was sure I had turned them off. I always did, even though I hated the moment of darkness in that basement. I pushed the door slowly open and stepped outside, carefully closing the door behind me. A sound. I paused. Is there a dog down here, sniffing around? I peeked around the corner into the little room that housed the washer and dryer and froze, heart so far up my throat I almost gagged. The neighbor was standing there, holding a pair of my wet panties to his face, inhaling deeply. I jerked my head back. Get out without alerting him was the thought that shot through my mind. I backed away, blindly groping behind me for the door. I got a hold of the handle, taking another quick step backwards just as I realized the door didn't actually open. I looked in horror as the elevator ascended, leaving me trapped in the basement with that man. Hey, neighbor. My insides froze. I slowly turned to face him, certain I was about to die. I guess these are your keys then. He held the keys out to me as he walked towards me. I frantically searched for something to say, something that would defuse the situation. Yeah, thanks, I managed. No problem. After a painful eternity, the elevator came back down. We both shuffled in and stood there without talking. My heart was beating so hard I thought he must be able to hear it. I could see my shirt move with each heartbeat, but what actually broke the silence were the deep, loud breaths he was taking. We passed the first floor, and I braved a glance in his direction. He was staring at my hair, nostrils wide, a look of pure ecstasy on his face. The second floor drew closer as I prayed to whoever was listening to get me the hell out of there. I practically jumped out of the elevator when it finally came to a halt. See you around then, he said, and entered his apartment. I slammed my own door shut, locked it, and put a chair in front of it for good measure. Then I sat down on the couch and started crying. When I finally calmed down, I called the landlord. He told me he couldn't really do anything. He only had the word of one tenant. He had never had any complaints about the guy. I needed to contact the police if I was scared. Anyway, he's moving out at the end of the month, sweetie. So don't worry too much. You'll never see him again. I didn't contact the police. I didn't, but I wish to God I had. Because I did see him again. A few years later on the news, when he was arrested for the murder of 3 prostitutes. All of them with long blonde hair. They moved in under the dark blanket of the night. My wife, Agnes, thought they had just run behind schedule. I thought they wanted to avoid being seen. Either way, we ended up with new next-door neighbors, and they fucking ruined everything. Agnes wanted to bring them a casserole after all. That's the neighborly thing to do. I told her to wait until they got more settled, that we shouldn't be bothering them so soon after they arrived. I really just didn't want to go at all and figured she'd forget about it after a few days. She didn't, but they wound up beating us to it. 2 days after they moved in, there was a sound outside our door. Agnes and I were sitting in the living room watching repeats of some crime show. She was obsessed with those things. When the knocks echoed through the halls, I saw Agnes nearly jump out of her skin. After all, it was after 9 p.m. Who would be at the door so late? I flipped on the porch light and walked slowly to the door, making sure to grab the bat I kept handy as I walked. I looked out the glass side lights, expecting to see some disheveled woman pleading for help, or maybe a masked man hoping for easy entry. It was neither. Instead, I saw our new neighbors, all 3 of them. They looked awfully pale, even in the dim light. The wife was holding some sort of baking dish covered in tin foil. I couldn't help but notice they all wore turtlenecks, even in the middle of August. I didn't want to let them in, but I didn't think I really had a choice. We had to be nice to these people. I invited them into the kitchen to sit down, while Agnes grabbed a robe and joined us. The woman introduced herself to me as Cornelia, along with her husband Christian and their son, Charles. She thrust the dish into Agnes' hands as she walked into the room, proudly proclaiming, "I made this just for you. I really hope you like it." "It's her family's recipe," Christian added, beaming as he looked over at his wife. I started to tell them that we had already eaten, but Agnes cut me off. "How thoughtful of you. We would love to try some with you all. Come sit down." "I'll grab some bowls." I shot her a glance that I hope said, "Really, honey? Why?" But she either didn't understand or ignored me. Instead, she pulled out some dishes from the cabinet and called our teenage son Marcus downstairs. We all sat down as Cornelia dished out heaping bowls of whatever she'd made and handed the three of them to us. It looked like a soup but was red and gooey. Little chunks of meat swirled around in it, and I could smell the intense stench of garlic mixed with other assorted herbs and spices. Agnes was the first to try it, taking a hesitant spoonful to her mouth and smiling before swallowing it. Cornelia watched her intently, seemingly waiting for her to react. "Wow, this is amazing," my wife lied. "What's in it?" "Oh, I couldn't tell you that." "It's a family secret," Cornelia replied, smiling. My wife shot Marcus and me a warning glance, and we each obligingly swallowed a spoonful of whatever it was. It was hard to choke down. It burned my throat in a way I'd never felt before. Marcus looked at me, and I swear I saw a tear welling in his eye. "Christian, Cornelia?" Charles' eye started. "Would you like any? I can go get some more bowl." "Oh, no, we've already eaten. Thank you, though," Christian said. I swear he was smirking at me. Oh, fuck. Something wasn't right. I was starting to feel dizzy. Before I could speak, Marcus interrupted me. "I'm sorry. I have a lot of homework to do. I should go upstairs. Thanks for the soup, though." "But Marcus, you've only eaten one bite," Cornelia said, rising with him. He quickly grabbed the bowl, nodding at her and carrying it begrudgingly upstairs. I knew he wouldn't eat it, but he was a good kid. Of course, he took it with him. Agnes and I made small talk for a while, avoiding eating the wretched soup as much as we could. Every now and then we'd each fake a spoonful before returning to conversation. Eventually I took it upon myself to end the evening. I told them I was exhausted, and they were quickly ushered out. I didn't sleep well that night. My stomach was churning, and I nearly vomited with every toss and turn. I could tell Agnes didn't feel right either. I heard her getting up several times and dry heaving into the toilet. I wanted to go comfort her, but I could barely move myself. It took our family 2 days to recover from Cornelia's soup. Marcus was out of school, and Agnes and myself called in sick to work. I wanted to yell at her for making us eat it, but it wasn't her fault. I have a feeling if we didn't eat it, it wouldn't have ended well for us. On the 3rd day, I finally felt well enough to go outside. I like to garden in the evening after the sun's hot rays have gone down. I was in my backyard tending to the rose bushes when I saw her. Cornelia was watching me out the 2nd floor window of what I assumed to be her bedroom. The way she looked at me disturbed me like I was prey and she was just waiting for the right moment to strike. I looked up and waved at her, smiling as though I wasn't shitting myself in fear. She simply raised her hand, waving at me before turning away. A week later, there was another knock at the door, this time closer to midnight. Agnes and I were about to go to bed when we heard it, and with a sigh, I got up to answer it. I almost shut the door then and there, but decided to step onto the porch and look around. That's when I saw the box. Against my better judgment, I brought it inside, locking the door behind me and setting it down on the table. I started to open it, but felt a heaviness in my chest as I did so. Searing pain raged through my hands as I slid them into the box, pulling out a large metal crucifix with a piece of paper attached to it. I read it, and the cross slipped from my hand. I screamed for Agnes and Marcus, telling them to get in the car immediately. They'd found us. We drove into the night, pulling into the nearest motel at the first sign of light. I thought we had been so careful, but somehow I'd overlooked something. The soup, the watching. It all made sense. Everything we did, every move we made, we were being observed. It all hit me the moment I read the note. It was a recipe for Cornelia's soup. Tomatoes. Ground beef. Paprika. Salt. Pepper. Chicken broth. Garlic. That last ingredient. That's why we had gotten sick. It was all a test, and we had failed. Under the recipe was a note in loopy, elegant cursive. We know what you are. These vampire hunters are getting better and better.